At the height of Irene, I'm very concerned because I'm the president of the Railroad Museum, and we got trashed, period. And we get trashed even when Phoenicia doesn't get trashed. Because when the water comes down and hits those dams, the only thing it can do is go over the approaches, which usually are lower than the roadbed. At the height of Irene, I came down and noted the Woodland Valley Bridge, all the water's going over, oh dear. And I got down the lower side of it. It was not, it was still 18 inches below. The only reason it was going over is because there were some trees jammed in there, and that was flashing it over. And at the same time, it was about a foot, maybe even 18, it was well over the Bridge Street Bridge. Okay, so just because Woodland Valley was half this, it survived in that sense. So the third thing, the trees jammed in Woodland Valley Bridge, and we weren't allowed to touch anything. People were trying to take the debris off the Bridge Street Bridge and everything, we got run out. But just 10 minutes with a chainsaw and we could have freed the Woodland Valley Bridge. But granted, it's a risky thing. But the third thing I wanted to address is the flotsam. And it's the trees coming down that hit the bridges, the trailers coming down and hit the bridges, the flaming propane tanks, seriously, I've seen them, that hit these bridges and knock them out, while the water damages the, there's a hell of a lot of force of water. I'm not understating that, but it's the flotsam that does the damage to the bridge. I propose that the DEC, at least half of us up here, at least supplement our heat with wood. And if they would make it easy for someone who can prove proficiency with a chainsaw, give them an easy permit to go in anywhere on their land and take out any threatening tree in the creek, on the bank, anything like that. Clean the banks up. And there would be two caveats. You have to, and also neighbors, if you get a permit for that. I mean, if you got a letter on the neighbors too. But you'd have to have permission. And then in a lot of areas where municipalities, county or state owned, some of those should just be free for us to pick that wood up. And I'll bet at least half of the problem would disappear by doing that. Now, that permit would also have to have, they would have to agree to, if they come on a big old soggy pine that they don't want, they have to cut that, in that area, they have to cut that up into, say, 8-foot bolts, so it's not going to go down as a tree. And they don't take it out then, but I can go on forever, but I just want to
check one thing as far as the trees go, and I had the experience myself, is with the flooding, they get so embedded with the sediment from the stream that you go through chainsaws like there's no tomorrow.
Yeah.
Which honestly, I've ran across because I got quite a bit of debris on mine.
Now they tell us how.
And I said, unbelievable. I mean, you cut an inch deep and your plate's gone. You know. And
they tell us how to cut them and lay them. I think with a butt upstream and all, and do that. You know. Well, that's only partly securing it. I say take them out. You know, or if you can leave them in to hold, cut them down so they don't wet. I've talked enough.
Can we get your name?
Yes. D-A-K-I-N M-O-R-E-H-O-U-S-E. I have three perspectives. One is the president of the Railroad Museum, which has about 3,000 foot frontage on the Esopus. An art center, almost defunct down here by Boulder Bend, which has about 2,000 foot frontage. And then Roxmoor Colony up Woodland Valley with about 3,000 feet frontage. And for 30 years, my bedroom has been right over one of these streams.
Well, we appreciate your comments. You brought something up that made me think. If people have photos, historic photos of either conditions near their property, in the river, during floods, during drought, that would be really helpful for us to get. And one of the things that we can do, maybe Rob can help us get that word out, is to be able to get a photocopy, or for those of you who have scanning ability to upload it, where we can actually interact with information. We can
Right.
set a pretty easy way to get onto one of our sites where you can just upload a picture or something if you had it digitally. It would be really helpful.
There's a lot of videos on YouTube of the flood.
Yeah.
Yes, we've seen some of them.
Now, one other thing, please. Lost it. Oh, yeah. Do you or how can one get hold of one of these cross sections of certain places like under the Bridge Street Bridge in the early 1970s when we were still allowed to
Not
remove
sure that's
that?
going to exist. We have some historic data.
Well, it had to for building the bridge, I think.
We do have, for some bridges, we do have we can't get our hands on the as-built, which hopefully actually show the channel. And then we have some historic FEMA cross-sections as well. It's not always as much as we would like it to be, but we will comb the archives, so to speak.
A comparison of those pre-dredging ban and what it is now would be very revealing.
Yes. The Army Corps of Engineers recently amended the floodplain maps. Is anything you're discussing here going to have any effect upon that?
I'll start, you can jump in. So we start with the FEMA, the most recent FEMA flood maps. And it's almost like, well, it's not quite like playing a video game, it's not quite that much fun, but we start with that and we say if we're looking down at the village and this is where the water comes to in terms of predicting how far out it'll go and how deep it will go. And then, as Mark said earlier, we start looking at things. What would happen if we replace this bridge with a different design, with a wider span, with a higher, with a more shallow girders? What would happen if we, widen the stream here or reoriented around a very restricting bend, et cetera, et cetera? At the end of that, what we have is using the FEMA technology, the same technology that they use to produce those flood maps. We have a menu, a recipe, if you will, of options that will reduce flooding. Before a project is constructed, you can apply to FEMA for what's called a conditional letter of map revision, a CLOMAR. And basically it says this: if we do this, the water will go down here, and you, FEMA, agree that you will amend your map to show that the floodplain has shrunk. And we've done many of these. Sometimes it's a number of different projects together, sometimes it's just one singular one. Sometimes we found some crazy FEMA busts where they had a 10-foot elevation difference, and we knew from living and talking with the people who lived in an area that it never really flooded like that. So sometimes you can go to them and just to say, this is the evidence for you to fix your map because it's not how you show it to be. Other times it goes in the opposite direction. So this will lay the framework to go down that path, if you wish, in the future, because as a payer of floodplain, of flood insurance, it's bad now, it's going to get a lot worse. And we haven't seen the worst of it yet, but we've heard some predictions that flood insurance could double, triple, quadruple, which would be a real hardship for
We got a one-year reprieve, is my understanding.
Pardon?
I believe we got a one-year reprieve.
Yeah. So, and the insurance companies are not quite sure what they're doing right now. It's like the Healthcare Act. None of the health insurance companies quite knew what to do for a while because they weren't sure how it was going to go. So getting people out of the floodplain in reality is important, but getting them out of the floodplain on a regulatory basis is also important. It will result in money in your pockets. So it won't get you there, but it'll sort of pave the way to get there. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Super.
Are you looking at flooding just from the sofas and the waterways, or also from the mountains when it comes, like the downpour?
So we have, I'm so glad you brought that up. We have two handouts on the back right table, and they have some very good sort of introduction to flooding and flood mitigation and local flood analysis. And you've got two pieces in this, and they're separate, but they're very related. So there's the hydrology. What happens with a drop of water that falls here? How fast does it get down to the river, and how much? and over a certain period of time. That's called hydrology. Once we know the hydrology, which includes far more than the stream, it includes everything in the drainage basin, which is every drop of water that goes towards the stream is the drainage basin. Once we have the hydrology, then we look at the hydraulics, which is how the river moves and flows and how deep and how fast and how wide the water gets. So we will be looking at hydrology for the entire contributing watershed, or the mountains, all the water that gets into Stony Clove and the Esopus in the study area. We will be hydraulically modeling potential mitigation improvements in the water courses themselves.
And let me say one more thing in case you were also asking this. We are studying riverine flooding on Stony Clove and Esopus. If there is a catch basin on Main Street or an undersized drainage system, that's not part of this analysis. That would, that's we wouldn't be going and measuring individual catch basins and making sure they're not clogged. Because sometimes you get pretty severe flooding, but it's not as a result of the river. It's a result of a municipal drainage system. So, and that's separate from what we're studying.
Good point.
Is part of your study also the rising of groundwater, where the stream rises, the water comes down from the mountain, forcing the water table to rise, or just?
Generally, when we're looking at pretty catastrophic flooding, and by the time you get that happening, groundwater is a pretty minor impact. I mean, at some point, the ground gets saturated, and so things are just hitting and flowing. But the point where we start analyzing this is when everything's saturated and the rain is coming in, you've got water, like big water. It's very scary to me to see the kind of damage, physical, structural damage, and human life damage that happened in Irene. And when you look at those points on the map, they didn't even make the 100-year flood, which we toss around like it's nothing. When it really happens, and we've done some similar work up in Herkimer County and in Montgomery and Oneida, and some of those floods they come up to like almost a 500-year flood. And so it really is pretty stark when you think about that. That was devastating, and that could happen again next week. So by the time you get to that point, groundwater is a pretty minor influence.
Have we
I didn't mean
ever
to
had,
sound scary. Sorry.
have we ever had, from your records, a 100-year flood here?
Not that I'm aware of, but the gauges only go back, I think, consistently to about the 50s. So.
I mean, at some point in
I'm sure-
time, yes. But
Yeah,
in
I'm sure it's
our
happened,
lifetime-
but whether or not we've recorded it. In Windham, that flood, in Irene, in the town of Windham, in Greene County, that surpassed the 500-year flood. So it really just depends on exactly where you were in the Catskills, because it's so variable.
But now, a 500-year flood isn't necessarily any worse than our 75-year flood. It just happens to be what was up there and what was down here. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I guess it depends on what's built in
Yeah.
the area that's getting flooded, because they had about 4 feet of water coming down Main Street there. I think I saw a video of a school bus, a short school bus, but still a school bus sort of tumbling down. It was
One of the
Pretty scary
things
to
that's,
look at.
I think, really important about this process is when you deal with FEMA and benefit cost analysis, everything has to work for the 100-year flood. Now, if I have a house and I got 4 feet of flooding in Irene, and you told me that I couldn't fix it so I didn't get any flooding, but we could make improvements so that I only got flooded half the time and only with 6 inches of water, that would be viable for me. I would very much like to see that happen. That doesn't get funded under FEMA. It's zero. It's a pass or it's a fail. With the LFA funding, it gives a pathway, a potential pathway, to actually get things funded that aren't the 100-year flood fix, but maybe it makes things a whole lot better for a lot of people. So we'll be looking at that. The other thing I do want to say, and we heard at the town board meeting from another gentleman who I don't think I see tonight, who was talking about dredging. We just need to dredge 15 feet deep and call it a day. One of the things that we're going to try and bring to this discussion too is a balance of getting improvement and being able to get it built. So we need to find that balance where we're not creating an unstable system where the banks are going to fail. We got to make sure that we're coming up with solutions that are sustainable. We also need to come up with solutions that are somewhat affordable, even if it may be a very big number over a number of years. We can't come up with $2 million solutions to take one house out of the floodplain. So it's got to be realistic and feasible. We also need to bring to the discussion what is likely to be permitted. We'll look at everything, and then our job is to tell you what is the best chances of getting things either funded or constructed or permitted. So not that nothing's off the table. Absolutely nothing's off the table. But we also want to put it in context of what is likely to be fundable, permittable, and doable. Even if it's not in the 5-year plan, as Mark said, we had in Praxville, the major bridge that goes over, it was just not cost feasible to replace it. So sure enough, came up on the governor's bridge replacement program. It's going to get done on the state's dollar. Now we've got information in hand, and we're meeting with DOT to say, this is what our hydraulic analysis said. So please, oh please, I cannot tell you how many bridges got replaced with the exact same bridge. And to your point, you go, have you learned nothing? Let's get a bridge that passes more water underneath it, that's maybe higher, that's maybe wider. So it may not be something that can happen next week or next year, but maybe 5 years down the road, 7 years down the road, when that bridge needs to be replaced anyway, now as a community, you have the knowledge to say, hold the phone, folks. Don't put the same bridge in, we'll have the same problem. So that's sort of what we're getting at in a short term and a long term. And I'm not Italian, but I do a lot of it.
Yes, Robert?
Janine, just to clarify a statement, that if there is a reduction of flood elevation from 4 foot to 6 inches in your home, that would dramatically reduce your flood insurance rate.
Yep.
Even though the project may not fully funded from FEMA.
Correct.
It would dramatically reduce the personal flood insurance rates for every residence.
Excellent point.
Yes.
Excellent.
And also the benefit cost analysis, it's pretty sophisticated software, and it looks, when we say we know what the project costs, whatever we're going to do, we know what we can make an estimate of what it costs. But the benefits are calculated by saying, if we could lower water surface elevations in this flood by this amount, then there's a lot of cost information in this software where they have an approximation of what it costs for your home, for an average home to have its first floor flooded by 6 inches of water. And if you can get the water just down under that first floor, in some floods, then there's going to be a benefit to that, and they can put a value on that. And that's how the benefit cost analysis works.
Exactly.
Just for my enlightenment, would FEMA consider, being that just about everybody in this building has a sump pump in their basement, if you get water in your basement, is that considered flooding according to FEMA?
If water during the FEMA 100-year event covers a portion of the land, regardless of how high or low your basement or your structure is, it's in the floodplain. So it doesn't, however, as Mark says, I was in Rhode Island this summer, and they got just completely obliterated by Sandy. So it's coastal flooding. And you drive down the street there, and there's new homes every other home, and they're all built, 15 feet in the air. It's kind of peculiar looking. They're still in the floodplain, but their structure is above it. So, it's still, even if you have an inch, if the water reaches that, it will still be in the floodplain, whether it's your basement or not. The difference is what the depth of water will be.
Well, because I'm a little bit dozen as part of the concept, I'll use my house, of course, is what I'm familiar with as the example. I live probably 150 feet from Stony Cove on Tremper Avenue, and there we have a unfinished basement. It has a drainage hole in the basement. It's got stonework foundation, which is really well built, what we suspected. They were very impressed with it. That'll be there a lot longer than the house. It routinely takes on water. We don't store things there. Spring and fall, to an extent, just from snow melt, etc., etc. There's no flood water anywhere, even during Irene and Sandy. The flood, lapped it, it overflowed Stony Clove, it crossed over 214, but it didn't get to our house. It, it's not well short of it. Our house is elevated steps, so we've had no flooding danger during that. But we have routine water that rises in our basement a couple of times. It's just the way the water table works there. Is that a flood situation?
Well, it's a flood for you, for
Well,
sure.
And are you in the FEMA floodplain? Like, did you have to buy flood insurance when you?
Well, I imagine we probably are now.
Yeah.
You
Well, we can look at the maps, because I've got the flood lines on there,
Right.
but, yeah.
You can experience flooding but not be in the floodplain. I think that might have been part of where you're getting at. You can have flooding from a number of non-river sources. It could be water coming down off the mountain, off the hill. It could be high groundwater, and you personally experience flooding. But if it is flooding that is not caused directly by the river and it doesn't come within, as Mark says, the riverine floodplain, then you flood, but you're not in the floodplain. And we can certainly take a look at that.
Okay, so what are the implications of those two types of flooding? In terms of insurance, in terms of, I understand we give you both,
Yes.
you now be in the floodplain, but just this typical raising of the groundwater in an unfinished basement that drains naturally.
That does not put you in the floodplain, and if you had a mortgage on your house, it does not require you to get a
We
flood
do,
insurance.
and when we got it, we did not need to have
Okay.
flood insurance.
You're probably outside of the floodplain,
But
although,
they're just revised, yeah. So.
this is true there. The other thing though too, because one of my sisters had a lot of damage in a finished basement. They are nowhere near a river as far as you can see. But their homeowner's insurance did not cover a penny of it because they didn't have flood insurance. So it was a hard lesson to learn, even if the bank doesn't require you to get insurance. If you're not in the floodplain, if you have water damage, a lot of insurances will not cover any damage like you might get.
Yeah, well, we had nothing to damage.
So I want to point out that Tom actually very familiar with this. This is one of the unique situations with Phoenicia with the new floodplain mapping. Okay, Tom is along Stony Clove, as explained, which previously was not mapped. So he has his basement elevation is much lower, obviously it's subterranean, lower than the flood levels. With the new flood maps though, he will be in floodplain. So now it gets to that situation where he's saying, I don't get flooded, but I get flood damage.
I get flood water, I don't get damage.
Yeah, it's flood water. So this is typical of a number of homes in Newton Avenue, Trevor Avenue, which are all going to be included in this new floodplain mapping because the Stony Clove was not previously mapped. So that's where the concerns are coming. That now he will be required, or future homeowners will be required to get flood insurance for those homes, even though they may not have been flooded. He may not have his equipment or materials down below in the basement. Again, it's a situation that needs to be addressed, and how do we address that?
I will also clarify that if you have a mortgage and you are in the floodplain, or you're selling your house and your buyers are buying, their mortgager will require them to get flood insurance. If you are, your 110-year-old Aunt Lou passed away and left you $1 million and you don't have a mortgage, nobody's going to make it, the federal government does not require you to get flood insurance. It's generally the bank that does. That doesn't mean you can't. A lot of people who are not required by banks to get flood insurance still get flood insurance because they still get damage.
So my point would be, to wrap up, I would like there to be a process, hopefully your process can help with this, whereby it can be somehow there could be an assessment made as to which of the properties that Rob was referring to, or temporary other evidence, where it's traditional. If people plan on it, if the groundwater rises a few inches in your basement, you do not consider that to be a flood event. You consider just you just don't leave stuff on the floor. But now we've moved into the floodplain. Is there any way of differentiating it? But we may not be at risk of a regular flood. Our ground floor was, we were at no risk during Irene and Lee. So
The only way to get yourself out of the floodplain is to do survey to prove that you're not in the floodplain. But if you're in, you're in. So you can dispute it.
But physically, like sideways out or elevated out. But you have to be 2 feet above the basement.
Well, a lot, some houses don't have basement. The fact that you have a basement, does that mean that, I mean, if a ground floor is not, is elevated above?
What's that, Rob?
Yes, yes, okay, so as FEMA regs, yes, your basement is considered your ground floor because it's subterranean, it's more than 3 feet below the grade next to you. So, yes, that will be considered your base floor, and your flood insurance rate will be based on the basement floor, regardless of whether you use it or not. And I'm gonna tell you, you're gonna hate to hear it, Tom, that lovely stone-laid foundation is gonna need to be filled in, and your house, the base floor elevation of the first livable floor will need to be at least 2 feet above whatever the elevation is predicted on this map. That's what they're saying. Now, your home, your base floor may be 2 feet above that base floor elevation. Again, this floodplain, I don't have a depth grade to say whether there's 6 inches of water that's gonna be overflowing your lawn, which may give you the 2 feet to your base flood elevation. But that's what we have to consider here and what we need to talk about. Again, elevating homes, is that a possibility? Elevating structures throughout the entire hamlet.
So,
That's
just
the
to clarify, elevate the ground floor or the basement? The ground floor.
You have to elevate the building possibly, but you may not have to elevate the building depending on, and Mr. Brewer will talk about elevation certificates, but FEMA recommends, they want you to be at the grading. They want you to be at grade. They do not want mechanical sump pumps or mechanical systems to remove the water from your basement. You should not be below grade. If you have a basement that is, I believe, and Janine and Mark can correct me on this, I think it's 3 feet below grade, it is considered a basement, and therefore that is considered your first livable floor under FEMA guidelines. And that's what your flood insurance is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of nuance in those,
There
what's
is.
considered a first floor, and I
Yeah,
think you're right, but
right.
I have to look at the regulations.
We can go through them.
Yes.
Or we can take the creeks out, like we did years ago, where we didn't get water in our basements. We didn't have the pressure built up where it came into the basement because all the creeks were dredged out and all this fill was taken out. A lot of times it was stockpiles and they used it, town used it, whatever. But this was back, it started in 1967 when the Funcrest, the dam broke. That was the first big high water issue we had in the 60s. Then in 1996, we had a major flood in town here. 2005, 2010 in October 1st, 2010 December 1st. And then of course Irene and Lee. Sandy didn't hit us. But these things have built up and built up. Yeah, the bridges, dig underneath the bridges, like they're too low now. The next flood we get is going to take the roads out in 3 or 4 different places. We're going to be trapped.